Trust, verify is like a key part, not just with employees, but actually in partnerships and relationships. You build trust, but you have to verify that there is corresponding trust, corresponding engagement with those partners. And so you don't end up as the one taking all the risk without actually there being a counterbalancing piece of those parties taking risk.
Alrighty, hello everyone and welcome to the Deal Maker Show. So today we have an amazing guest, a guest that, it's been quite the journey, close to a decade, with his startup. And again, obviously a decade in the world of startups. Imagine, as in dog years, if you compare it to corporate, it's a lot. We're going to be talking a lot about, the cycles. We're going to be talking about the way to think about focus, capital raising, all of that good stuff that we like to hear when it comes to building, scaling, financing, and all the above. So brace yourself for a very inspiring conversation today. And without further ado, let's welcome our guest, Andrew Jamison. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Alejandro. Looking forward to the discussion.
So originally, from the UK, I would say, but with parents from Australia, from Sweden. So you had that interesting combination early on as part of your upbringing. Give us a walk through memory lane. How was life growing up for you, Andrew?
It was confusing. And I didn't really know where I was from. And I had to assimilate, actually, to lots of different cultures very, very quickly. It was very clear early on that I wasn't French, despite being in a French system. And then I went to the English system to go to boarding school. And it was really clear that I wasn't English because I spoke with a French accent. So it kind of creates an interesting play, really, where you sort of very much trying to sort of figure people out and trying to understand, right, the cultural differences and how to sort of drive, right, that assimilation. And I think that's actually served me really well later on in life. It's a challenge in the moment, but actually afterwards you realize understanding culture, understanding how people react to different things actually is super helpful in driving engagement with people, which ultimately drives trust and all these other things, right, so they're critical in business. So a bit of an Achilles heel when you're a kid because you want to be like everyone else, but actually a great asset when you grow up.
So tell us too about the sabbatical, man, when you were traveling around too. You're talking about cultures, getting to understand people. I think that's everything when you are in business, right? And when you're able to really listen for concerns, listen to really for after you've been able to understood someone, what can drive that person, given maybe like where they're coming from. What kind of perspective, the travels, the cultures, how do you think that has helped you to being an entrepreneur?
Well, so I think the best part about traveling when you're young is you have no money. And so you're stretching everything. And so again, you're engaging with different elements of society right across the board. I ended up going to Australia because my father's Australian, and I was working as a storeman and packer, right, with people storing, stacking boxes that you were sending out for shipments. I then worked on a sheep farm. And I actually worked there sort of in two different stints, once during the shearing season, once during the sort of the castration period. And again, working with people who'd never been more than 4 hours from the farm I was working on. And then I was coming from the other side of the world. And despite being Australian, for them, I was very English. And obviously, I sort of tried to deflect that and said, no, I'm sort of really French because I know the Australian and the Brits have a bad rap. And of course, what had happened at that period is when the French went and shot down the Greenpeace ship. So that didn't go down very well. But all in all, look, you learn how to relate to people irrespective of where they come from, what part of society they come from. And again, welcome to life, right? And more relevant probably still inside of a startup because you're really dealing with no brand. And so you have to build that brand, build that trust across the whole ecosystem. So I think really helpful in that guise as well.
Now, in your case, you went to Bath for university, and right after that, you went into consulting. So, why consulting out of all things?
Look, it's interesting. For me, consulting was just a way of discovering what I liked to do, and I had a choice. Actually, I had a choice of joining sort of one of the three strategic consultants, or actually going to work with a startup in the SAP space. SAP was growing really fast in the mid-90s. And I remember my father famously saying to me, it's like, why would you go into strategic consulting? You actually don't know anything. It's not that he was wrong. And you learn different things, right? And in some respects, the first couple of years, I sort of regretted it because I realized very quickly that strategic consulting, you kind of learned about, the famous 2x2s, 3x3s, and how to sort of like present things and do different things. I learned something very much more foundational going into consulting. I learned about coding. I learned about sort of the logic of things and how you have to relate things back to the database and how that whole piece has to work. And then I learned actually a core functional skill, which is accounting, because I focused on finance. So I really learned two different core skills that actually have paid back again. Over time, they pay back. And I think that's, for me, the most important thing to do and learn when you're in the early years is learn something and learn it really, really well.
What about the way that you relate it to problems? Because in consulting, there's a lot of grabbing big problems, breaking them into small ones. What about your relatedness to problem?
Well, I think consulting gives you entrepreneurship of the mind, right? It's kind of like you're always on your feet. You're always trying to stay one step ahead of the client, right? And you don't also have the legacy of having been inside that company. And so to some extent, you're a bit of a free spirit and you can really rethink things. Now, some of the things are really stupid and you're quickly told that, but you learn, right? How to rethink problems, how to look at problems completely differently. And that helps you to really sort of come up with real innovation in my mind, right? You've got to follow it through, because the problem with consultancy is you often don't get to the execution, right? So that's why I said it's like, it's entrepreneurship of the brain, because you're constantly being challenged to stay one step ahead of the client in a discipline that they clearly know better than you in some cases. And then I think, when I later went into enterprise, well, then you get sort of more entrepreneurship around execution, and then you can meld the two together. And I think that's where the startup world sort of really comes together for me, is bring the best of the two together to sort of keep sort of driving things. But for me, consulting was truly about being nimble. We were 50 people when I joined. Within 5 years, we'd grown to 700 people organically. And so I was suddenly finding myself flying to the US, sitting in front of the one of the sort of boards of Polaroid, talking about how they should think about their systems from a finance perspective and how that should all roll up and how they can give them flexibility and how they get insights into, right, what was happening inside of their company. And there I was 27 years old. So it's a benefit of being in that small but really fast growing, as you get pushed into many, many things. And I got a breadth that you wouldn't have gotten if I'd gone to one of the big sort of the big consultancy firms. You wouldn't have had that same ability to straddle across so many different things.
Now, for you, you did your MBA at INSEAD, and typically people that do their MBAs, many of them, they end up launching their own business, right? I think in your case, you ended up going to American Express, but what do you think was there for you? Why were you avoiding starting a business?
Look, there's two parts to that. I think the first for me was a little bit of a comeback to when I went into consulting into a startup, and it was, we're 50 people. And yes, it was a bit more of a classic consulting, right? It's about bums on seats and billings and everything else. But I really missed the idea of sitting behind a massive brand, right? I was jealous actually of people having this brand that they could sort of walk in a room and instant credibility. We came from a small consultancy firm that grew really fast, went public, right? But it was not a real brand, right? And so for me, it's a little bit of that. That's one part of the piece, right? It was a little bit of me, no, I need to understand what it's like to work for a big brand. Number two is my father was an entrepreneur. And so he went through 3 or 4 different businesses, and I kind of saw what that world was like. Right, it's fast, it's furious, in a totally different field. He was mostly into shop fitting equipment into massive hypermarkets in France, right, from shelving all the way through to digital labels that you sometimes see on shelves today for pricing, and it was hectic and it was nonstop. Right, it didn't matter if it was Friday night or if it was Sunday morning. It was always treadmill, always moving, and meanwhile I saw my uncle, who's an executive in the pharma space. Living in Switzerland, I kind of like the big brand thing again, right? So anyway, two different worlds, and it's really circumstantial that I ended up starting a business. Again, I didn't leave even AmEx thinking I was going to do that. I left for different reasons, right? Which again got me to where I am today.
So, as you were pointing to, you went to AmEx and you were there for about, let's say, 12 years or so. After that, you left, because of family situation. I guess walk us through the sequence of events that needed to happen for you to be like, okay, now it's time. Now I want to bring Extend to life.
Well, so again, I learned so much at American Express, right, around sort of structure, around culture, around elements of execution. It's a great factory, actually, for people. And I chose to leave at a time when Amex was going through its own change. We knew a new CEO was coming in. Ken Chenault had been there and sort of been like, this huge sort of figure inside the company. And there was a new set of emerging potential CEOs. Steve Squeri obviously became that and has done extremely well as a CEO. You look at the share price and it's eye-popping, so amazing. But for me, it was just time. I was often being told, and I was part of the executive leadership program there, and I was told, Andrew, you need to go into consumer, you need to sort of see different parts of the business. And I didn't particularly have any interest to go into that side of the world. I was really deeply ingrained in product. I was deeply ingrained in B2B. And I wanted to stick with that train because I felt that was a TGV. And I felt that, the consumer business was a steady, rolling local train. And so I had no intent of moving out of B2B. That was the first thing. But then my mother got sick for the fourth time. And for me, it was a bit of a life moment of like, you know what, you suddenly realize life is finite. My mother had sort of dodged a bullet 12 years beforehand. I'd been living in the States for a decent period of time. And I was like, you know what, I actually just want a time out. And I realized taking a sabbatical was not going to give me the time out I needed. What actually transpired in that time out is I actually had time to think a little bit back to, Amex saying you should go into consumer. It's like, okay, but stop all of that. What do I actually like doing? And that was the first fundamental thing that takes time, because you've been influenced by a million different people saying, this is, you're good at this, you should do this and whatever. And it's like, okay, but put that all aside. I have no projects to work on. What is it I fundamentally like? And what I realized was I liked building things. I like figuring out problems and simplifying, right, what those problems and challenges can look like. And so ultimately I sort of realized fundamentally at the core, I love product, right? And I love consulting with clients who have challenges that need to be overcome. And so that was the first thing. And then I started thinking, okay, how do I go and solve some of the challenges in B2B? And it quickly became apparent to me that there was lots of challenges around making technology available to different segments of customers, even inside of the corporate card world that I lived in. And that's when the idea dawned on me that this concept of people receiving a digital card had been completely constrained because of legacy technology. And I was like, well, hang on. At the end of the day, we all use credit cards, whether we're consumers, as a household, or essentially we're a massive organization, a global organization. And so why should digital credit cards not make their way across the gamut? And so then I started going into the idea of like, well, hey, today companies hire so many freelancers and contractors who can't use corporate cards. It's like, well, what if we now create a platform that would allow that? So the first thinking about it was, there's a huge travel opportunity in actually giving people access to spend on company dollars rather than having to go and use their cards and get reimbursed, right? And that's where we started the company in that 2017 timeframe. And we all know what happened a couple of years later, right? COVID hits, no one's traveling, right? And in fact, most contractors lost their jobs. But what that highlighted to us then was there was an even bigger problem in B2B spend of how do you tackle sort of the tail end of suppliers, and actually how would you handle this massive emerging trend around subscriptions, where suddenly employees were signing up for subscriptions, right? But many of these employees didn't have a card. And if you look at today, and I look at Extend's business, right, outside of rent and employees, 68% of our expenses go on a card, right? My web hosting services go on a card, right? All of my sort of Jira and ticket tracking goes on a card, and it's distributed across the whole team and employees. And so very different world that we live in today when you're building these products and you're enabling people through these different tools and solutions, just need a different product.
So for the people that are listening, Andrew, to get it, what ended up being Extend? What is the business model of Extend?
Great question. I sort of went straight from 0 to 100. Really at Extend here, we're really about serving the SMB segment with really spend and expense management tools that are really right size for these companies that are less than 1,000 employees, right? Less than 100 million in revenue, and really making tools easily accessible to those teams, right? And what we saw emerge in the US was I'd say neo issuers like Brex and Ramp. Essentially, they were facilitating the life of startups who had capital but no credit history, and therefore they still needed to have credit card products. And I was like, well, why do people have to change relationships in order to get access to technology? Why can't we overlay technology onto the existing legacy stack and enable those same software workflows that help businesses become more efficient? And so spend management for me is about digital cards with controls up front, which says, Alejandro, you can only spend this amount of money over this period of time and potentially with just these type of merchants. And expense management, like, great, irrespective of what card you use, a digital or a physical card, how do I ensure that that spend is compliant? And how do I ensure I can get it into my books and close my books as quickly as possible, right? It's annoying spend because typically it's smaller tickets, but there's so many of them and it just piles up left, right, and center. So how do you make that nightmare go away, not just for the users, but actually for the approvers and also for the finance department that has to deal with all of that at the end of the month?
So also walk us through how was the experience of raising money. I guess you guys have raised about 70 million to date. What has been also the journey of going through the financing cycles too?
I must admit, for me, that was the most mind-boggling piece. Right? Having been in sort of large corporate, you sort of spend your time begging for budgets, right? And the cycle starts earlier and earlier. You know, when I was there, it started in August. You know, it was approved in December. Now I feel it starts in May almost. But so I was used to sort of presenting and sort of putting things together, but I had no idea as to how you went about to raise capital. And so we had a couple of failed experiments. Famously went down to somewhere near Washington to meet with one particular partner. I said, don't worry, it's going to be 3 of us in a room, you know. But the night before, he rings up and says, I want you to change your story. I want it to look like this. And so we did that. We got on the train. The train was delayed 2 hours. We rushed in the door. We're 5 minutes late. And there's 16 people in the room, not 3 people. And then we tell a story that, frankly, we didn't really mesh with. Right. And so you can imagine the train came off the track and it was one of those things where you're like, you know what, if I'd been back at AmEx, I'd be fired right now. But valuable lessons come out of it. Number one, you're always going to get delayed. So get there the day before, right? Don't even think, even if you even have 2 hours window, it doesn't really matter. It'll get eaten up somewhere along the way. So get there beforehand. That's a basic 101 thing, right? I should have known that a long time before. But number 2 is don't let someone else tell your story. Right? And that's a really important thing, I think, for entrepreneurs, right? A little bit different, right? I'm, unfortunately now in my 50s. At the time I started the company, so early 40s. And at the end of the day, I built experience around this. Doesn't mean I can't take input, but the story is different, right? The story about the company, why now, why this, has got to be something that the entrepreneur owns and shapes, because you need to own the narrative around it. You can't have someone else trying to retell your narrative. So a huge takeaway is saying, great, I'll take the feedback, I'll adjust the story, but I'm not going to rewrite the story to meet your needs of a story, because it's going to ring hollow when we present it. And that's actually what happened. And that's, in a way that, again, shapes you. You then bounce back and you go through, and we presented to our first investor was actually Point72 Ventures. And so, we eventually end up meeting up with Steve Cohen, having breakfast. And that was an interesting experience in itself. It's like, don't worry, it'll be 5 minutes. And then before we go in there, he says, by the way, he may have a large position in one of the card networks. It is no longer also going to be 3 people. He's brought the whole extended executive team. And it wasn't 15 minutes. It was an hour and a half. But it was a great meeting, really, really great meeting. And we really sort of dove a little bit more into sort of the data behind that we were collecting and kind of what we saw we could do with it over time, et cetera, et cetera. And so, 3 months later, a check came through and we were off, right? We were off. And that was obviously a huge milestone. But I forgot one piece, actually, in terms of what the expectation from investors is, and this was a learning, was as someone coming out of a large corporate, totally unknown force in the world of entrepreneurship. And so there was kind of a mandate, actually, that they wanted you to raise money from friends and family before you even got to the venture capital. And that was a bit like, cool, we know you did well in corporate, but you actually have people here who would back you into doing your own venture. And so we actually went and raised 250,000. We had 10 people put in checks for 25K from across different parts of the industry, different parts of the world, to give us credibility, but also help us to build the MVP, a fully functioning MVP where we could take a virtual card and go and make a purchase in a shop with a card number on our phone and actually prove that the solution worked by the time we got to point 72. And that was another learning, right? Which is this aspect of trust that the investors wanted to see as a sort of stepping stone to actually them putting in $3 million and say, okay, let's go build this company.
What does it look like with investors when trust is present?
Look, I've had, I don't know if I'm lucky, but I've had a phenomenal relationship with my investors, and it's a very respectful relationship. It doesn't mean they're all easy conversations. In fact, quite the opposite. They're often difficult conversations because trying to solve difficult business problems. And I think a good relationship with investors is good in bad times, right? And it's good in good times. Good times is easy, right? The tides are rising. Everyone's raising a lot of money. Everyone's a hero. But when the cycle comes back and the water recedes, right? That's when the warts come out. That's when people's real personalities come out, and that's when you figure out if you have a good working relationship or not, right? Is when that happens, and I think a lot of that is built on being transparent with investors. There's only so much window dressing you can do with your investors, and investors, to be fair, spend maybe 2 days, right, 3 days in a quarter actually really thinking about you, so they only have a very limited time through which to absorb information. So packaging up the information for the board members and making sure that it's really easy for them to get through it, and really highlighting where the pros are, the good, the bad, and the truly ugly, and making sure that there's communication there. Because once the investors have invested in you, they've got your back. But they've got your back if you've been honest, right? I think that's where things fall over sometimes, is kind of if you've been telling a different story and it all catches up with you. And I think then relationships are pretty fraught.
Absolutely. Now, in your case, let's say you were to go to sleep tonight. As we're talking about investors, obviously they're too investing and betting on a vision, as well as the employees or even the customers. But let's say you go to sleep tonight and you wake up in a world, Andrew, where the vision of Extent is fully realized. What does that world look like?
Look, I think the big question everyone says is, are you going to go public? Are you going to what is the journey for this? Look, I think the reality is most companies get bored, and I think you have to go through that phase, and then maybe you outgrow that phase. But you first got to go through the likelihood of being purchased. And I think the reality of why would you be purchased? I'm not a B2C. I'm a B2B kind of company. And in some respects, I'm B2B2B. And so you have to realize that there's massive power in the card networks. There's massive power in certain issuers. There's massive power inside of processors who desperately need technology in a world where they still operate around green screens, right? They've not fully moved to the cloud yet. And so I have to recognize, by being kind of Switzerland and actually partnering with all the networks, partnering with multiple massive issuers and smaller banks, at some point the reality is, do you grow faster in that ecosystem? Now, there's a couple of outliers that come into this, which is, but software companies are also coming into the game, right? There's been a bunch of acquisitions that have happened recently, right, where different players in this space have been acquired, right? And so I think you're starting to see the blend of financial services having to be more into technology, and technology companies realizing they have to be more into payments. And so the worlds are colliding. So you can imagine some of the accounting solutions out there are going to need to do spend and expense management, because doing the general ledger won't be enough over time because others are coming into that space. So that's another piece. And then I think because of the underlying ecosystem we built, where we built trust, right, with the card networks, we've built trust with issuers. I think AI and agentic AI is also going to be an interesting place here, because all we've heard about AI so far and about agentic side is really about the shopping experience, but we've not heard about any banks, right, participating. And I think we're not heard about any banks because at the moment there's this challenge of, hang on, the agent has destroyed the liability and the split of liability between merchant and bank issuer, right? And so how do you bring that back into play? And I think there's a role for someone to step in and say, hey, I'm going to reach back out to that user and say, hey, did you mean to make this purchase? If yes, here's a digital card to pay for it. And it's only valid for a very short period of time. And then it's over and done with. And so I think that's a role that we're already starting to see is developing around us. And so there's interesting players in there.
Now, we're talking about the future. I want to talk about the past with a lens of reflection. Let's say I bring you back in time, maybe, I don't know, let's say 10 years ago when you were at AmEx. And let's say you're able to see that younger self coming out of the building, last day in the office, and you're able to give that younger self one piece of advice before launching a business. What would that be and why, given what you know now?
I would certainly think narrow, right? Be really freaking focused, right? Because you have so limited resources. And that's the big thing, right? The temptation is to go big and broad. And you're sort of told when you're working inside of big companies, like, you're going to have this big strategy and all these different things. The reality is things don't get built that way. And so my view would be like, trust, verify is like a key part, not just with employees, but actually in partnerships and relationships, right? You build trust, but you have to verify that there is corresponding trust, corresponding engagement with those partners. And so you don't end up as the one taking all the risk without actually there being a counterbalancing piece of those parties taking risk. And sometimes that comes in the way that you shape contracts, right? But sometimes it also just comes in the way of the amount of resources you sit behind something, right? Without there being any tangible results yet.
Now, for the people that are listening, that would love to reach out and say hi, perhaps learn more about Extend, what can you tell them?
Look, I would obviously I love having these kind of discussions. I love meeting new people, and that goes back to curiosity, which is one of our core values, and is how I've lived my life because of the international nature of things. They can reach out directly to me. I'm readily available on LinkedIn, or they can reach out through email, which is andrew@paywithextend.com. Always really happy to engage with people who are looking for advice of, hey, how do I deal with strategics, right? How should I structure things in the financial ecosystem or in the software world? Those are two worlds that I know really, really well, and I know how they marry themselves together, and can certainly help folks avoid different pitfalls that certainly we all encounter along the way. No one builds it perfect first time round. And so, again, always happy to help in that department.
Amazing. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for being on the Deal Maker Show today. It has been an absolute honor to have you with us.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks again.